All right, excited to get into the Word with you. We love these Bible survey lessons and hope that you do as well. We have our slide up there on the screen for you to show us our title tonight. And in very small print, there is some verses. Really only one that I need help with. We are going to glean, again, this is just survey, all right? So if you're new here, don't think, we're going to be here for about 5 hours. No. It's just surveying. But we're going to look at 10 chapters, overview 10 chapters of the Bible tonight, 2 Samuel. And then I need somebody late in the service to read from Luke 1, verses 29 through 33. Somebody want to go ahead and volunteer for that? Just mark it in your Bible, please. If you're asleep by then, I'll wake you up, okay? Miss Sherry, thank you so much. She's got it. And the rest of us, we'll just go ahead and turn to chapter number 1 of 2 Samuel. In our English Bible, there are 66 books of the Bible, and that is something that we should certainly know and respect. However, in the original Hebrew Scriptures, 1st and 2nd Samuel was really just one long book, and it being so lengthy was just kind of split up at this key time, a key event that we read about last week. So we are starting a new book, but the theme really just continues. In fact, the story picks up at the very exact time of where we ended last time, which was after a long period of Saul pursuing David, Saul died on the battlefield. And remember, it wasn't David that killed him either. With Saul dead, it was time for a new era in Israel, and we see a new book here, 2 Samuel, picking up right where 1 Samuel ended. In fact, like I've already said, in the Hebrew Scriptures, 1st and 2 Samuel was just together as one book, the book of Samuel, if you will. And so we're going to give a few thoughts tonight, I believe about 5 or so. No, I lied to you, about 7. 7 thoughts this evening that we're going to look at. And trying to keep it fairly simple, but still glean some great truths as we survey the Scriptures, okay? Number 1, we want to see this. David mourns for King Saul. David mourns for King Saul. This is in 2 Samuel chapter number 1. 2 Samuel begins with David getting the news of Saul's death. An Amalekite young man runs into town and tells David that he found Saul wounded and then he killed him. And that was a lie, by the way. If you were with us last time, 1 Samuel 31 tells us that Saul was wounded, but then he fell on his own sword, taking his life so that I guess he wouldn't be tortured or abused by the Philistines. And so the Amalekite young man was trying to impress David by making up a lie that he had killed Saul and would now serve David humbly. But that did not impress David. If you know David, that's no surprise to you. Instead, it angered him. Remember, David could have killed Saul anytime he wanted to, right? God gave him a lot of power. God gave him opportunities to prove to Saul that I'm not out to get you. Cutting off that coat, taking his spear, wasn't it? And I'm going to take these things and show you that I was right there on you and I could have got you, but I didn't. Because you know what? God put Saul in that place of the king. It wasn't for David to remove him from the kingship. God said he would do it, and God did it in his way, his time. That's a great lesson to us also about vengeance and all, or the lack thereof that we need to have in our life. So, when this man took credit for killing Saul, David showed him how it was wrong and then put him to death. In fact, 2 Samuel 1, look at verse 14. David said unto him, How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, Go near and fall upon him. And he smote him that he died. And David said unto him, Thy blood be upon thy head, for thy mouth hath testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. Say, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about bad Saul. We are, but he was still in that position, Lord's anointed. Again, God made him king, God would remove him from king. Can I remind you tonight a little Christian truth that we all need to respect the authorities that we have in our life and not rebel against it. Right? Saul was still an authoritative figure, and David showed some respect for that man and for the office. And we may not like certain things that's going on, maybe even in the church, certainly in our country, even maybe even local government. We need to have some respect for those offices and so forth, and of course still try to stand up for what is right. Now, 2 Samuel 1 then shows us a sad poem or a song that David wrote. It's what's called a lamentation. And David is there mourning for Saul and mourning for Jonathan, his dear friend. And he honored the office that Saul held, and he missed Jonathan, his dear friend. So point number one was quick and easy tonight. David mourns for King Saul. Secondly, David reigns as king of Judah. That's worth noting. David reigns as king of Judah. And we find this in 2 Samuel 2, 3, and 4. In 2 Samuel 2 through 4, we find that David reigns as king of Judah. All right, after that event, David asked the Lord where he should go, and God's answer was to go to Hebron, which is in Judah. And there the men of Judah came up and anointed David as king in verse number 4. Saul's leader of the army, his name was Abner. He's still living, and he went and he took Saul's son Ishbosheth and made him the king over the rest of Israel. Thus there was a split between Israel and Judah for a time. Two different kings. War between them broke out. The sides met with Abner leading the army for Ishbosheth, and Joab was leading for King David. Men from both sides were killed in battle, but really the Bible tells us of a very disturbing one-on-one fights, that they were picking the kind of the youngest guys. Hey, just go out there and just wrestle around with swords and spear until somebody dies. Just an awful thing that was going on. And also after that, after being chased, Abner kills Joab's younger brother named Asahel, or Asahel, Asahel. And a truce was made between the sides after that, and the fighting stopped, for a while. We got to remember that God had already anointed David to be the king, right? God anointed Saul, and then he anointed David. That was years before. So we know what God's will was in all of this, right? Who are you going to root for, David or Ishbosheth? Some of you probably say, I've never even heard of Ishbosheth. Yeah, it was because it was David's job. He was supposed to be the king. And so God proved it that God was on his side by blessing David as the new king instead of Ishbosheth. In fact, look at 2 Samuel 3, chapter 3, and verse 1. Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. I want to be on God's side, right? And he will strengthen us. If we rebel against God and go against God, then we're going to get weaker and weaker, spiritually speaking at least. David's also blessed with children, this chapter tells us, and he's having quite a few kids that we'll learn about later. But during all of this, King Ishbosheth and his army leader Abner had a big disagreement. Again, these are two people on the same side, supposed to be. But now they're in a big disagreement. And Abner then decides, he says, really? We're going to fight over this when I have fought for you? And Abner said, you know what? I'm going to decide to switch sides, and I'm going to go submit to David instead. And so King David makes a deal with Abner, his former enemy, and accepts him. And Abner then spoke to the rest of Israel and told them to follow David. Look with me at 2 Samuel 3, beginning in verse 17. And Abner had communication with the elders of Israel, saying, Ye sought for David in times past to be king over you. Now then do it. For the Lord hath spoken of David, saying, By the hand of my servant David I will save my people Israel, out of the hand of the Philistines, and out of the hand of all their enemies. And Abner also spake in the ears of Benjamin, and Abner went also to speak in the ears of David in Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel, and that seemed good to the whole house of Benjamin. So again, we see that Abner standing up for David, and standing up for really the Lord, as he calls out what God had spoken there in verse number 18. Here's an enemy flipping to the right side, if you will. Abner comes to David, makes a league with him, and then David sends him out in peace to unify Israel. So it sounds good, right? Well, yes, and Abner does seem to have a true change here, but Joab got word of it. That's the problem. Joab was David's main man to lead the army, and Joab was very angry that David would make a league with this former enemy. He hated Abner for killing his brother Asahel. Remember us saying that earlier? See, Abner had killed Joab's very own brother, and so he's having this personal grudge. And in fact, Joab tricks Abner. Hey, the king's got a message for you. Come on back here. And he meets Abner and kills him when he wasn't expecting it. And when David heard the news, he was very, very sad about this. In fact, David publicly honors Abner at a burial and cries, and he mourns for him. And the people of Israel could see that David did not want Abner dead. And they knew that David had a good heart, the Bible tells us. And because of all this, Israel all the more respected David as the new king. You know, sometimes when we read the Bible, we say David was a man after whose own heart? God's own heart. And sometimes I think, how is that? Because we've seen his whole life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But this is a good passage to remind us of the heart of David. That even an enemy like Saul, even an enemy like Abner, he can show some grace. He can show some mercy. He can show some understanding and even some forgiveness. Instead of taking out vengeance, when they change, or he gives them plenty of chances to change, we can see that he has a good heart, a heart after God. And that's an encouraging thing for sure. We need that in our own life. So after Abner's death, 2 Benjamite men came, and guess what they do? They secretly kill King Ishbosheth. And while he's resting on his bed, here's the new king, all right? Resting on his bed, they come in and they behead him. They take off his head, and then the men run off before anyone could catch them. Real bold, right? Real bold for these soldiers. And then they bring the head of Ishbosheth to King David, hoping that David would be pleased that they had killed his enemy. You think that's going to please David? Nope, not going to please David. They don't know David. But as we know, David becomes very upset, and here's what he says to them, and here's what he did. Look at 2 Samuel 4, verse number 9. And David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, and said unto them, As the Lord liveth, who hath redeemed my soul out of all adversity. When one told me, saying, Behold, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good tidings, I took hold of him and slew him in Ziklag, who thought that I would have given him a reward for his tidings. How much more when wicked men have slain a righteous person in his own house upon his bed? Shall I not therefore now require his blood of your hand and take you away from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they slew them, cut off their hands and their feet, and hanged them up over the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the sepulchre of Abner in Hebron. All right, so he's tender in a way, but David can be a tough guy, obviously, right? He's a mighty man of valor, we've seen. But he stood up for what was right. He just stood up for these people and said, we can't take them in their innocency, if you will. It's different fighting on the battlefield, but this was something that God was supposed to handle. David wasn't going to just run in and sneakily, commit murder, and he's not going to allow others to do that either. So, this all helps to show the kind of person that David was. And so we see that David's reigning as king of Judah, but you're ready for this, aren't you? Thirdly, David reigns as king over all Israel. And that's what 2 Samuel 5 teaches us. David reigns as king over all Israel. Finally, all of Israel gathers together to make David the king. Look at 2 Samuel 5. We've been waiting on it, the climax, for a few weeks now. Chapter 5, verse 1. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that led us out and brought us in Israel. And the Lord said to thee, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be a captain over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron. And King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. I love good summary verses like that, don't you? That's worth marking or taking note of. It helps to know the timetable and what's been going on. So David's reigning over Judah Wow, for a length of time there, right? 7 years and 6 months. So a good bit of time with Saul dead and Ishbosheth, in pretending to be king at least. Who's the real king? Well, David is. In fact, I just noticed it, don't have it in my notes, but look at verse 3. So all the elders of Israel came to the king, and then they anoint him king. He's already king before they anoint him king, because God had already anointed him king, right? Who's the king? David, because God said so. And they just needed to line up and accept that, if you will. And so David is reigning as king over all Israel. The promise of God was kept. David was king, and what a king he was. David soon after conquered the city of Jerusalem, where enemies still lived, and it became the capital. You ever heard of a city called Jerusalem? Anybody ever heard of that one? Right? Yeah, pretty big deal, right? Well, here's where it happens here in 2 Samuel 5. They take it from the enemies, and it becomes David's home place, the capital of Israel. Another king, Hiram, king of Tyre, Tyre, befriended David, and he sends David supplies and workers to build David a nice house. So what made King David so special? It was God, of course, and because David followed him. Look at these key verses now. 2 Samuel 5, verse 10. And David went on and grew great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. Verse 12. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. I love verses like that too, that tells us the real spiritual matter, the heart of the matter. David says, you know what? Things are going well. I believe this is God's plan. And it wasn't for David, it was for his people, Israel's purpose, right? And so there's things maybe just bigger than ourselves. It's the plan of God, and we just need to find our place in that, in the will of God, and do what God has called us to do. Whether we're king or peasant or somewhere in the middle, we all have got something to do for the Lord, and just let His will be done and be faithful to follow Him. Also, even though he shouldn't have married multiple women, God does still bless David with many children over the years, this chapter tells us. The Philistines didn't like the news that David was set up as king over Israel. They didn't like that. Remember the Philistines? They had this big champion guy, 9.5 foot tall, what was his name again? Yeah, Goliath, right? We all know him, the Philistines. They didn't like this David guy, who was such a mighty man and a hero. And so they came to fight against him, and David sought the Lord on what to do. God told him to go up and fight, and that God would give the victory. Israel wins, but the Philistines come again. And David asked God again what to do, and this time God gives a different message. Look with me at 2 Samuel 5, verse number 22. And the Philistines came up yet again and spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, Thou shalt not go up, but fetch a compass behind them, and come upon them over against the mulberry trees. And let it be, when thou hearest the sound of a going in the tops of the mulberry trees, then thou shalt bestir thyself, for then shall the Lord go out before thee to smite the host of the Philistines. And David did so, as the Lord had commanded him, and smote the Philistines from Geba until thou come to Gazer. Wow. So, interesting passage for sure. God is leading David, so much so, even to battle tactics, right? And they're out on the field. Sometimes they're just going to advance. Other times, God says, you know what? Don't go right into it. I want you to go over here, and you get near the mulberry trees, and God's in control of all things, right? He's even in control of the weather. And so I'm going to send a little wind, and we're going to get this swiftness of the trees, and you're going to see them moving. That's a sign that it's time to go and to get them. And David, look at verse 25, did so. Isn't that what it all just boils down to? God tells us what to do, and we just need to do it. Just obey. Trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And so they do that, and God gave the victory. Bringing us to our fourth thought tonight, while David's still king, a very key story in the Bible, and worth noting, is that David leads in moving the Ark of the Covenant. David leads in moving the Ark of the Covenant. So David's the king now, and he wants to move the ark to Jerusalem. That was where the capital of Israel was now and where David was living. The ark, you remember it, right? It's that special golden box that held the 10 Commandments. and in the future would have some, at some point in time I should say, would also have some manna and Aaron's budded rod. It also had angel statues upon it. The ark was where God brought His glory down, what some people call the Shekinah glory of God, and where God would meet with Israel. And David made a plan to move the ark with a very special celebration. Unfortunately, David didn't follow the directions that God had given to Moses on how to move and how to treat the ark. Instead of carrying it with rods like they were supposed to, the men put it on a cart and moved it that way. Remember, God said, no, you got those little rings on the side and you're supposed to stick the staves through it, and you get 4 guys and you're going to lift it up, and you got 4 guys, so you're controlling it better and you're not touching it. But they don't follow the directions, and they put it on a cart with some animals, pulling it along in a bumpy ride, you could say. They didn't strap it down like guys do today on the trailers, right? And so there's going to be a problem, unfortunately. In fact, there's some spiritual lessons here that we're going to see in just a moment. The ark was not supposed to be touched, as it represented the holiness of God. But when the ark began to fall off the cart, one of those guys that was nearby named Uzzah, or Uzzah, however you want to say it, U-Z-Z-A-H, Uzzah touched the ark to hold it up, and God smote Uzzah that he died right there. And this was supposed to be a big, happy celebration. Can I remind you tonight that there's a spiritual lesson here? Pastor Gary, when I became the pastor, and I said, hey, I would love for you to write a sermon, and I'll preach it for you at our anniversary service. We'll try to do that each year. And so those first couple of years, he could handle, a lot of the writing and typing and things like that. And so the first year, I believe it was, he wrote us a sermon from this text, and he called it 3,500 words. That's what it said at the top. And I said, wow, I don't know what that means. Why did you call it 3,500 words? He said, that's how long the sermon is. It's 3,500 words. I'm like, okay, thank you. Don't know what that got to do with the message, but all right. So I announced it, and we laughed that his title was 3,500 words. But there's a lot of great spiritual truths in there that we learn from this passage. We all need to remember that if we want to do something good, something for God, hey, we've got to do it God's way, right? Everybody out here in the world says, oh, I'm a good and kind person. I'm out here trying to do good. Well, listen, it's not good if you don't do it God's way. There are many people that try to be religious, but they aren't following the Bible, and thus they are not following the Lord. Friends, listen, we don't make the rules. God does, right? We just need to respect Him. Simply trust and obey. Love that theme. Somebody needs to write a song, call it Trust, Obey sometime. Afterwards, David was displeased, of course, when he saw this happen, and this man died, and he left the ark in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months. But while there, God was blessing Obed-Edom's house because of it. And realizing that, David then said, well, okay, God is blessing this house. So, well, let's finally move it. Let's move it right and get it up to Jerusalem. And David plans to move it, this time doing it the right way, apparently. And he threw a big celebration as the ark entered into Jerusalem, and he offered sacrifice. The Bible even says that he was dancing before the Lord. Michal, David's wife, made fun of David for how he acted in the celebration. And because of that, God punished her that she was never able to have children. Isn't that something? We got to read the Bible and believe it, right? If I was David, I don't know if I'd be dancing in the street either. But if David's dancing and he's the king, I'm not supposed to get out there and make fun of him and point fingers at him, right? And if you don't believe that, the Bible's very clear on it. David didn't make a mistake over here because his wife even was trying to reprimand him for it, and she was punished for that. And so I think there's just a little quick lesson that kids and adults alike need to understand. We don't need to make fun of people, especially God's servants that are doing God's work. Don't pick on people. There are consequences when we look down on others and when we speak badly of others. So we see that David leads first the wrong way, but then the right way, moving the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. Bringing us to a fifth thought tonight. David is promised an eternal kingdom. This is good stuff. David is promised an eternal kingdom. This is found in 2 Samuel chapter number 7. God was surely blessing David, and after getting rest from enemies, David had a desire to make God a house. Instead of having a tent-like tabernacle for the Ark of Covenant, David wanted to make a nicer, a fancier, more permanent place for the Ark to dwell in and for God to come down and meet with them in. Yet, God did not want David to do this. God spoke through a prophet named Nathan to David that God didn't need a permanent house. Instead, God turned it back to him and said, I'm going to make you a house. A spiritual house that would last forever. If you've been sleeping, now's the time to wake up. You want to get this. This is good Bible stuff right here. 2 Samuel 7. Look with me, please, down at verse number 12. And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, God speaking, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from it, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so did Nathan speak unto David. Guys, did you get that? Tucked away back in the Old Testament, you see what God's saying? I'm going to bless your royal line. I'm going to bless your kingship. Not just for earthly things, not just, one man or even ending up even for just one people. No. God's saying, I'm going to bless this. 3 times he said it, forever. Forever. God says, David, there's going to be somebody from your bloodline forever to sit on the throne. And so we get David, and then of course we get Solomon, and then we're going to get, who comes next? Rehoboam, that's it, Rehoboam. And who comes next? The next one in Rehoboam's line. That's hard, isn't it? You would only know it probably if you just wrote a Bible survey lesson about it this past week like I did, okay? Because I got to stay a couple lessons ahead. I'm pretty sure it's Ahaziah is the next one, okay? Or is it Abijam? See, now I'm even mixing it up. But it's one of those. It's one of those A names, okay? There's a bunch of them in there. We're going to look at that here in a few weeks. Not important right now, just some trivia. But God's saying, I'm going to bless this. And it goes down. And then, they go into captivity in Babylon. But there's always supposed to be a man that sits on that throne. Interesting. And then we come to the New Testament, right? And we come to this little young lady named Mary. And God says, hey, you're going to have a child. How shall this be, seeing I know not a man? Well, the Holy Spirit's going to come upon you. And this, in fact, the Bible uses a phrase, the holy thing. I mean, how do you describe this situation? That Jesus Christ is going to come about. And then the Scriptures, in fact, tells us exactly what that meant. Let's hear it right now. Luke, chapter number 1, verse 29 through 33.
And when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and cast in her mind what manner of salutation this should be. And the angel said unto her, Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God. And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom thou shalt be no end.
It's good stuff, isn't it? Good Christmas verse. Love that passage. But that's not just a Christmas verse, friends. That's still future, right? That's future. Jesus Christ born, he's going to get that kingdom and reign over it forever. That's what Sherry just read to us, right? That's right out of the Bible. So Jesus Christ, he's supposed to be the next king, and then he dies. He dies. And what happens 3 days later? Tell me. He resurrects. He comes back to life. So he's not dead any longer. So guess what? It's still his throne. We're just waiting for it. It's still his throne. Did God break his promise from 2 Samuel 7? No, God can't break a promise anyway. He cannot lie. All right? He kept his promise. Jesus didn't set up the kingdom then. He's going to set it up later. This was not in my notes. This is too deep probably for the kids, but let's just park it right here and just say another word. When Jesus Christ came to this earth the first time, He came for a lot of purposes, in fact. Testify the truth and so many other things. But when He came, and John the Baptist was the forerunner, okay? What's He saying? They're preparing for the kingdom. The message was, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven talks about God's rule on the earth, that there is a literal kingdom. That's what they were waiting for. Do you think all of these people of the Jewish nation at that time really understood all of the details of Jesus Christ coming to die for their sins, be buried and resurrect? They did not. The Bible tells us that they didn't understand. Even His disciples, the 12 that was going around with Him, are clueless about it. In fact, the Bible doesn't even tell us that they believe on Him and believe in the resurrection until they see it for themselves. They go to the tomb, and then John and Peter believe when it's empty. All of that time, Jesus had said lots about it. Yes, that He's going to die and be buried and resurrect. But what they were out preaching was repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. They were waiting. Jesus is going to be the king. He's going to beat these Romans. We're going to beat them. And so they were looking for a literal fulfillment right then and there. But what did Israel do? They rejected Him. And so God, in His sovereignty, He postpones the kingdom. And God puts something in the middle. There's going to be a kingdom. Christ came. The forerunners already came and told us that it's coming. The kingdom is going to come, but it hasn't come yet. It's going to come still in the future. And God puts this mystery in between. That mystery is me and you, the church. It's lasted 2,000 years. Bible said to people like Daniel and said, there's going to be all these years, right? These 70s, right? 70 weeks and so forth. And to almost the exact, no, not almost, exactly to the exact week that when Jesus died for them. And then there would be one more week, which was a 7-year period. That's the tribulation period to come. But it's broken off. That all of that was fulfilled, but there's 7 more years to be fulfilled. In between that is this mystery, the church age, and that's me and you. Listen, when Jesus Christ was born as a little baby and the wise men and the shepherds come up, they're not all saying, ooh, this man's going to grow up and die for me on the cross. They could know it based on Isaiah 53 and things. They could, don't get me wrong. But most of those people are saying, this man's going to be our king. We want him to literally reign on a throne and beat all these Romans up. But they didn't get it. Because God in His perfect plan says, no, they're going to reject. And Christ has to go to that cross and He has to die to bring us salvation. Before Jesus could be the king, He had to be the Savior. And boy, I'm so thankful that He died for me and you. And I'm thankful He didn't just do it for the house of Israel, but that He opened it up to Gentiles like me and you as well. And friends, we are in the church age, and it's an age of grace. And this has nothing to do really with my lesson tonight, but I just wanted to tell you some things that I've been studying with my doctoral program, and boy, I'm getting excited about it at home, and I'm glad for the church age and that we are a part of it. So, how do we see Jesus in 2 Samuel? I've already told you. We see Him as eternal king. Solomon can't fulfill this. Verse 14, committing iniquity, yeah, that's Solomon. There's going to be a lot of sons of David that's going to commit iniquity. But there's only one that can have a kingdom established forever, like in verse 16. There's only one that the throne would be established forever. No mere man can do that. We die and we go to the grave, but only God can do that. And so Jesus Christ is both God and man. We see Him as eternal king. Praise God for that. Amen? Let me give you a couple other quick thoughts tonight, and we got to go home. Number 6, David is victorious in battle. David is victorious in battle. 2 Samuel 8 is where we see that. It's showing us many victories that God gave to David and the Israelites. When enemies came after them or threatened them, God protected him and blessed David and all of Israel. Unfortunately, it was a big time of warfare in David's reign, but he's winning. We see him winning. They're getting victories. David's leading the Israelites to victory over the Philistines, Moab, Zobah, Syria, Hamath, Edom, and more. In all of this, David gets many gifts from nations that made deals with him and from all the spoil that they won in battles. They got things like silver and gold and brass and shields and chariots and horses and even people that would serve David. But David dedicated all these things to God, and God gets the glory for all the victories. Twice in the chapter it says that the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. In verse 6, verse 14. David also had a great team of warriors and leaders, the chapter tells us. I just want you to know that David was a victorious king. But what I want to bring it home in and finish up with tonight is our seventh thought, that David shows kindness to others. If there's anything I love studying about King David, is that he was a kind king. He's a kind king. In fact, the Bible tells us that he is kind to Saul's family. Would you look at chapter 9? David, being the good king that he was, he looked for a way to show kindness to others. And David respected Saul for being king before him. And David made a covenant with Jonathan. We said that that would be important. Here it is coming back up again. Now that they were dead, David looked for a son of Jonathan so that he could be a blessing to him. I love this story. We got to look at it before we go. 2 Samuel, chapter number 9. Look with me at verse 1. And David said, "Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when they had called him unto David, the king said unto him, "Art thou Ziba?" And he said, "Thy servant is he." And the king said, "Is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him?" And Ziba said unto the king, "Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet." And the king said unto him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said unto the king, "Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodabar." Then King David sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, I guess we should say, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar. And when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, thy servant." And David said unto him, "Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually." And he bowed himself and said, "What is thy servant, that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am?" Verse 9. Then the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, "I have given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul and to all his house. Thou therefore and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him, and thou shalt bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread alway at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then said Ziba unto the king, "According to all that my lord the king hath commanded his servant, so shall thy servant do. As for Mephibosheth," said the king, "he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons." And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all that dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants unto Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he did eat continually at the king's table, and was lame on both his feet. I love that chapter. I really do. That's such a special chapter, isn't it? Thought tonight is we see David as a very kind king. He's showing kindness. And think about how busy and how much of a fighter he is. And he's actually sitting up there on his throne going, "I wonder if there's anybody I can show some kindness to in Saul's house." Think about it. This, again, showing the heart of David. I love that. And he finds somebody. Here's Mephibosheth, that another passage of the Bible tells us that in fleeing out, the woman that was taking care of him dropped him, and he gets paralyzed. And he's not even able to walk. He's lame on both of his feet. So he's carried in, or he's rolled in, or brought in into David's presence. And Mephibosheth, who knows what he's thinking, right? I mean, he's Saul's grandson. Maybe David's going to get him, take care of him once and for all. So he comes and he says, "Behold, I'm like a dead dog. Why are you going to be good to me?" But David knows his name and calls out to him and gives him many, many good things, going to till the land for him, letting him sit at the king's table. And boy, doesn't that all picture God and picture Jesus Christ and how what God does for us? You might can see Jesus in Jonathan, of course, but we also see him really just as the king. Remember, Jesus is the one that's reigning as king one day, not God the Father per se. So don't just see Jesus in Jonathan, see Jesus in the king. And as the king, he's wanting to show kindness, and Jesus is wanting to show that to us, and he knows our name, and he calls out to you, and he calls out to me, and he brings us into his presence, and he says, "Hey, I'm not just going to not kill you." No, he said, "I'm going to bless you. I'm going to feed you." In fact, you can sit right here with the king's sons, because we become sons and daughters of God. And friends, we can see how good David is, but we also see in this passage, how is Jesus in 2 Samuel? Well, he's not only the eternal king, we see him as the kind king. Jesus is a very kind king, and I'm thankful for that. We're pretty much out of time tonight, but you can read chapter 10 to see that David is also kind to the Ammonites. Here's another group of people. The king dies. I'm going to send some people over to treat you right. And in fact, unfortunately, they see that David was maybe tricking them and that these comforters would actually be spies. And so they mistreat them and strip them down naked and shave off their beards, which would have been, again, very embarrassing and disrespectful for the time. And so David's looking for kindness, but then they just stirred up trouble, and then they paid for it, that's for sure. And so God is out here to give kindness to people that will accept it, right? But unfortunately, that same kind king is going to pour out judgment on those that won't accept his free gift of kindness. That's not my notes either, but that's good stuff right there, isn't it? I want to be like Mephibosheth. I don't want to be like the Ammonites, okay? So as we close out tonight, this lesson shows us that David finally becomes king of Israel, as God had foretold years before. Shows him being the king and mainly his victories as the king. David's a good king, a man after God's own heart. As 2 Samuel 8:15 shows, David did right as a king. Can we see that verse on the screen, please? And let's say that out loud together. Here we go. 2 Samuel 8:15. And David reigned over all Israel, and David executed judgment and justice unto all his people. 2 Samuel 8:15. That's the kind of king he was, and we need to try to be people like that. Hey, we're not going to be the king, but we're just to serve. We can be knights for the king, if you will, and serve him, and we need to be showing kindness and goodness to others as well. All right, I'm going to let you out of here, but you got to answer my questions first. Number one, what is something that David did as king? Somebody tell me. Lots of answers there. What's something David did as king? Yeah, love that. Showed kindness, especially to Mephibosheth. Wonderful. Something else? What's that? Moved the ark. Yes, brought that into Jerusalem, the headquarters, if you will. That's good. All right. How is Jesus in this portion of 2 Samuel? What's a type of Jesus? Eternal kingdom, that's right. He will reign as eternal king, and also not only that, but he's what kind of king? He's a kind king. And we've already answered it, but say it out loud. Who did David show great kindness to? Mephibosheth. What a name. Love that. And if you can't say it or spell it, you can just say Saul's grandson. All right? And that'll help too. Well, that looks at the good news of David, and next time we're going to see, unfortunately, King David's sins and consequences, but God still uses that man in spite of those sins and gives forgiveness. So until next time, we better stand up. We'll dismiss with a quick word of prayer. We got the kiddos, and they'll be all down in the gym if you need to pick up the kids. Anybody needs to